Well, welcome to the 4 p.m. panel, and I'm looking at the wrong description. Here we go. Welcome to the 4 p.m. panel, SOMOS, Stories of Illness, Trauma, and Healing. So graphic medicine is the intersection of comics and stories rooted in medicine and health-related issues. Comics offer a vehicle for conveying difficult stories surrounding taboo topics such as physical and mental illness, loss, and recovery. So we welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion of how the comics form works as a uniquely healing medium. And on a personal note, this is a project that I'm working on as an anthology, as a collection of stories with the same title. And it's taken quite a while because one of the issues when you are working with this kind of storytelling is the issue of re-traumatizing, right? Where we're telling these stories over and over. So our featured panelists today are Padilla, Alex Schumacher, and Barbra Dillon. And I will be handing over the mic to each of them to introduce themselves, and then we will continue with the conversation for the next 45 minutes. So welcome. All right, so let's get started with Amber.
Hi, my name is Amber Padilla, and I'm a cartoonist in Ghana.
There you go. Yep. Okay.
Oh, I can hear myself.
And we'll start with Amber Padilla.
Oh, so the panel I moderated had no mics. So my name is Amber Padilla, and I'm a cartoonist and illustrator. My first graphic novel came out in October of 2021. It's called The Secret Garden on 81st Street, and I'm really proud of the work. And my first graphic novel that I've written and illustrated will be coming out in 2024, and it's called Sugar Coated, and I have the first zine version of it at my table. And in terms of graphic medicine, I'm still working on a project with Theresa. It's called Adrift, and the project was written by Luis Manriquez and Bad at speaking. And it's a really beautiful story that really feels very relevant and very close to an experience that many people may have had during the pandemic. And that's me.
And I forgot to mention, whatever your comfort level is with the masks, please feel free. So thank you. Welcome, Amber. And then Alex.
I'm Alex Schumacher. I'm also a cartoonist and writer. Started out with a couple of webcomics, decades of an experience in Mr. Butterchips. Mr. Butterchips kind of pivoted in 2016. It started out sort of as a homage to underground comics of the 60s and 70s, but after the election in 2016, took kind of a hard left into some political commentary and satire. I've done a couple of graphic novels, and unofficially, I have one coming out next year. We haven't actually announced it yet, but it does deal with things like shared family trauma and Alzheimer's, so quite a bit of the graphic medicine like Theresa was talking about. I also had a short published last year in Fabrice Sapolsky's Mutiny magazine, which was dealing a bit with my wife and I losing our first child last year. So it's just been, for me, comics are a way to kind of distill those experiences and share them with other people in a way that you can connect. That's very, very specific to comics. And it's something that's immediate and, I guess, I don't know, just affecting. I found it to be very affecting for me in a way that some other mediums maybe aren't.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Alex. It's great to have you here. Barbra?
Yes. Hi, I'm Barbra Dillon. I'm the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Fanbase Press, which is a publishing company and geek media website. Later this year, and I have to give mad props to Dr. Rojas because really through her recommendations or advice and help, we will this summer start publishing a 5-issue series called Ripple Effects, which is our first foray into graphic medicine. I myself was completely unfamiliar with the genre of comics and have been simply bowled over by not only Graphic Medicine International, which is an amazing organization of which Dr. Rojas is on the board, but the support and the breadth of content of creators delving into graphic medicine all across the world. So we're excited to be talking about in our series Invisible Disabilities, and even ours specifically about a young man who has type 1 diabetes, but also superhero abilities. And in each issue, an individual will be sharing their own lived experience with a different kind of invisible disabilities, including Dr. Rojas. So, announced here. You've heard it here first.
Exclusive. I did an essay. And it was awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing about that essay is that it started as one thing, because I think the prompt was, how do you live on a day-to-day basis with an invisible disability? And I'm diabetic. And that was the one that we were kind of focusing on because it's relevant to the story. And I started writing one thing, and this is good for my students who are here. I started writing one thing, and it turned into something completely different. And part of me wanted to have a visual element, but we have deadlines and a festival to prepare, so straight essay. But it was great to think about this journey and think about navigating the world as someone who has an invisible illness, and it's a chronic illness. And also thinking about, and this is related to what I want to kind of launch with, this idea of the things that we go through as human beings, the traumas, the illnesses, the processes of healing, and how we express those stories in comic form, in the comic medium. And we'll do this in the form of whoever wants to speak up, please go. So I'm wondering, I forgot to introduce myself before I asked that question. So I'm Dr. Theresa Rojas. I am the director of the Latinx Comic Arts Festival. I am a professor of English and Modesto Junior College's first professor of ethnic studies. I'm very proud of that. And so I'm the organizer of this event, and I have a very close and vested interest in graphic medicine, which is that intersection of comics storytelling and health-related stories, medical-related stories. I'm on the executive board of the Graphic Medicine International Collective. I'm really happy to be part of that organization because it allows me different forums to talk about these stories and the creation of these stories in comics in particular, because I'm very, very much interested in visual culture. And I teach almost exclusively comics in every class. Whenever I get a chance, I do that. So coming back to this idea of telling stories through the comics medium, I think Alex touched on this a little bit. So maybe we can start with you, Alex. The question of why do this in comics? What is different about telling this kind of story in comics form? And in some ways breaking a taboo, right? So to kind of take us there a little bit and talk to us about why comics.
I think for me, since I was a kid, and I think this is probably true for most cartoonists, it's just a language I developed to express myself from a very young age, so it just feels natural for me to express, certain experiences and tell stories in that medium. And there's just such a specific way that you can marry, words and illustrations to create a certain kind of experience that you don't get from other mediums. And I've just always found that to be something that's been something that I connect to personally, on a very personal level, because again, it's a very immediate art form. And so it's just been a way that I have always felt very naturally expressing myself, and writing is something that I've kind of honed and loved as well, just writing prose. But you don't have the same kind of economy of words when you're doing prose, because you have to say everything. So when you have comics, you can let the artwork do a lot of the walking for you, and even some of the panels, some of the pages can be pantomime. and emotions, experiences can all be expressed specifically through the visual aspect of that medium. And so when you're using the graphic narrative art form to its fullest, it's incredibly impactful, and I think it touches people in a way that they may not even realize to begin with. It's something that sort of, gets under your skin and down into the marrow of your bones if done correctly. So it's just an art form that I've always loved and felt connected to.
I love that. The marrow gets down to the marrow of your bones. That's just, that's so good. Does anyone want to add to that? I feel like I don't know.
Yeah, I think thinking about that, it's so much easier to convey an emotion through a drawing than it is having to write it. So you can have a character who's feeling sad, and just a very small change in their expression can evoke that emotion from the reader. Where, as you're saying, with prose, you have to write, and then the character felt very sad, and her eyes drooped, and she began to weep, and evoking that is an art form of its own, but the economy of words that you were saying can be evoked so much faster with illustration.
And I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, with it.
I think both to Alex and Amber's points, the fact that sequential art in and of itself, if we think back to cave drawings, it was the earliest form of not only communicating with one another, but of sharing our stories and sharing our truths, who we are, where we've been. And so to have not only the sequential art, but to have the impact and the ability to share that story with other people, and especially to Amber's point about if you just have the image, you're working across languages at this point. It's something that can be inherent to everyone universally on a human level. And I think that something as impactful as medicine and health, and no matter what that means in terms of health, whether that's physical health, whether that's mental health or otherwise, it's such a universal language to be able to share that through a visual medium.
It's kind of the cartography of our time to some degree. It's a way to document, shared experiences and specific, periods of time too, because there's been a lot of comics about the pandemic and about, some of the things that have happened politically in the last 5 or 6 years. So it's a way to document that as well.
Alex and the turn of the phrase today.
I love it.
So good. So good. I want to turn to Barbra for a second and have you talk to us a little bit about how you got involved with Ripple Effects and what is the project and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So Ripple Effects, as I mentioned, is a 5-issue series. It was brought to us by a colleague and friend, Jordan Hart, who himself is someone who, for the majority of his life, has been affected by something called thrombophilia, which is a blood clotting disease. And again, another example of an invisible illness or invisible disability, and something that has truly changed his life. He actually had to move from a very cold climate on the East Coast to the West because cold weather dramatically affects his health, and he simply can't survive in that environment. He had been wanting to tell a story about his experience, about his life, and to provide hope to others for those who may have gone through something similar for a long period of time. But it was just, when you have something that's a little too close to you and it's too hard to, as you said, Theresa, talking about re-traumatizing yourself, some people do not have the coping skills or healing skills yet with whatever their trauma might be or whatever lived experience they may have to reshare that or to speak to it with other people. So instead, he wrote a story about a character named George who, as we mentioned, has type 1 diabetes, and shared the story that way. So he was still able to get his truth out, his lived experience, but by doing so with an invisible disability, which he still knew quite a bit about. His best friend has type 1 diabetes and has lived with that for the majority of his life. So he brought it to us. We loved Jordan as an individual and how much hope and inspiration he gives to us just as a human being. And then reading this story, which was so filled with hope and was really spoke to a specific audience of not only those individuals who have invisible disabilities, but their families as well, and saying like, hey, this does not define you. It can enhance you, it can improve your life, It's just about reframing. It's about finding a different path and a different way of looking at things. That this really cannot encapsulate you entirely, but can just show you the possibilities that are in front of you.
I love that, and I want to ask Amber to talk a little bit about the project that we're working on together. So this is the Frontline Workers Project is about bringing stories that are written by frontline workers. So that very thing, people who have been on the front lines during COVID, and it's a collaboration. So I'm the facilitator and also in this case the editor. And we have a writer, Luis Enriquez, and then Amber is the illustrator. And I'm really interested from your perspective about this collaborative work within graphic medicine and what that's been like for you.
Yeah, I think for me it was, I really jumped at the opportunity to be able to bring a frontline worker's story to life because it's an experience that is oftentimes talked about on the news, but it's not an experience that you get firsthand information from. And I just really wanted to be able to bring a visualization for a frontline worker into the world and sort of provide a service for them. And because they provided so much service for all of us during this pandemic. And yeah, it's been a really wonderful experience to be working on because of that. And knowing that this work will, hopefully be healing for some people, because it does, again, I had mentioned before, it has this feeling of sense of like really encapsulating this experience that we all went through. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to for people to see it. Yeah.
Well, on a personal note, it's been such a joy to work with the two. They're so easy to work with. It's been quite lovely. I wanted to ask Alex, because I'm a big fan of decades, and I think I read, what's the name of the literati book?
Defiling the Literati.
It's a book called Defiling the Literati. It's so good. It's so good, and that brought your work to my attention, and then the webcomic, is it Decades of Inexperience?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Decades of Inexperience is just so good. Talk to us a little bit about that and your inspiration for that, and the overview.
Sure. So Decades of Inexperience was a webcomic that I started in 2015, and it was like late 2015. This was after a period of about 3 or 4 years where I had kind of abandoned comics for a little while, because this was before graphic novels or comics in general were as popular as they are now. They've had this big resurgence, which has been great. But at the time, 2010, 2011, I had gotten a few gigs in the industry, but sort of fizzled out, and so I was kind of trying to reframe or reimagine what I was going to do. And I was encouraged by a friend, or a mutual friend, who was an editor, to explore more semi-autobiographical comics, like life comics. And so Decades of Inexperience was born out of that conversation, and it was pretty much just that, a semi-autobiographical webcomic that ran for about 5 years. And it covered a multitude of personal experiences, from anti-Semitism to alcoholism to, again, shared family trauma. And we decided to end it after about 5 years, because when we started, we met the main character, Luke, at a very low point of his life. And when we sort of went through the arc that we wanted to go through, this sort of redemptive narrative, we ended in a place where he wasn't perfect, he wasn't healed, but he was in a good place. And I feel like sometimes that's the best objective you can hope for, because there are a lot of things that will never heal. There are a lot of things that you simply, learn to live with. And that's not always a negative thing. So Decades was sort of working inside of that framework. And yeah, and Theresa, Dr. Rojas discovered it and liked it, and kindly invited me to take part in this festival, which I'm always honored to be here, and really happy to be back this year. But yeah, there may be some adaptations of decades of experience coming in the future.
I am waiting for the graphic novel. Like I say, the trade, I'm waiting for it. I will teach it. Because this is something that I've said about all the work that I teach, is that I always am looking for meaty business, right? Stuff that has some good meat on the bone. As a matter of fact, when I first started saying that when Barbra asked me to write a study guide for Quince, which is a fantastic trade that Fan-Based Press puts out. And I was like, I don't know. I have written study guides before, but we'll see if there's enough. You know, we'll snobby about it. we'll see. And of course, it turned out just beautifully. I think that was the beginning of our working relationship. Right?
I think so.
And now, full disclosure, both Barbra and Amber are on the advisory for the Latinx Comic Arts Festival. So I'm so happy to have this discussion, which is really good. I don't think we have this discussion enough. So I want to come back to Alex for a moment and ask if you would mind sharing a little bit about this, the new story, the journey that you mentioned with losing your child.
Oh, sure. So it was a short story. It was about 5 pages, published in a magazine called Mutiny Magazine. And there's a gentleman named Theresa who was a senior editor at Humanoids, and he's the co-creator of Spider-Man Noir, so he's done quite a bit of stuff. And we connected because he started a new publisher called Fair Square Comics, which is dedicated to telling stories of marginalized groups. So since we were both Jewish, he asked me to contribute something to this anthology. And my wife and I, early last year, had experienced a pretty devastating loss where our first child was a stillborn. So there was a part of me that was hesitant to share that, but I had some conversations with Fabrice about that, and it became kind of evident over the course of those talks that maybe this was something that somebody else needed to read, even, one person, 5 people, that wasn't really the point as much as it's important for us to tell these stories and share them with other people who may need to read them. So I sent him a proposal, and he liked it. And so it was published in, I believe it was November of last year is when the magazine came out. And, to some degree, and I think we've all experienced this, those comics and those stories can be incredibly difficult to tell. And like Dr. Rojas has said, sometimes it's resurfacing those traumas, which can be really painful. But at the same time, it can be healing and cathartic. And I found it to be a way to process that in a very different and, in a way that I hadn't before. Yes. But it was, I'm glad I did it.
I think that's so important to mention that too, because graphic medicine has this just super interesting intersection, right? So you have comics and you have these stories, but it's also, there's a healing element to it, there's a traumatizing element to it. I mean, even in just writing the essay for Barbra, and thinking about, I hadn't thought about myself as, someone who's living with an invisible illness every day and having to deal with it. But it's very true. One of the things I started writing, that I actually started doing drawings or the detritus that I call the little bits of being diabetic. So all the pen needles, all the little plastic things that if you come over my house, you're going to step on these because they're everywhere. It sounds horrible, like I don't think of the tracks, but you lose track of them, and the little aluminum bit that's on top of the pen needle, and I ran out of insulin, and the pen needle that you didn't quite make it in the trash. It sounds like a monkey did, really. But but there's a certain kind of, when you start to take these things apart and figure out, make the rhetorical choices for my students. You make those rhetorical choices. What parts of the story am I going to tell? What parts of the story are okay right now? What parts of the story do I still need to pull back for a moment, for me or for whoever? In my case, a lot of the art that I've produced in the last few years is very connected to my mother. She even gets a mention in my essay. Shout out to my mom who did not a comics, she's diabetic. But those, you have to think about, who all is involved. Is it my story to tell? And then the rhetorical choices of the visuals. This is what I'm really interested in. I want to come to Amber for a second. Talk about in translating this work from writing. So we got a script. We got a script from Luis. And Luis had some direction, so he had a vision, right? And then I gave feedback, and then it went to Amber. So Amber gets this textual document, and then has to turn that into his story, right? His story, and trying to honor what he's trying to do. So talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I feel like I lucked out with a writer who had a clear sense of how text can be translated into visuals, and I think it was because he studied some film or something like that.
And he had done it before too. This was, I think, his second
He had done another project with somebody, and so I felt really fortunate with that, because you can certainly have a writer who is maybe a little too verbose, and if there's too much dialogue, it takes away from the capacity to create an image that's evoking emotion just from the image itself. And I felt really fortunate to have a lot of leeway to take and interpret what he wrote and illustrate how I felt what it was he was trying to convey through my illustrations. And it, just to sort of piggyback off of that, I was realizing that The Secret Garden on 81st Street is also sort of graphic medicine. One of the characters is dealing with anxiety, and on top of that, it's also about grief, and it's about children dealing with grief, and also how that affects the family, and how to grow through it and move, not necessarily move past it, but to grow. It's about a garden. And, I was very fortunate again to have this really beautiful script and to work off of. And the writer, her name is Ivy Noel Ware. And, just being able to embody these characters and feel the feelings that they're feeling and be able to put them on paper and say, like, hey, you can also experience this through these pages. And I had a really interesting experience with my father who read the book, and he was like, I finally processed, he didn't say processed, but I finally had some thoughts about my father dying because of this book. And he had never told me something like that before. And it's just sort of this realization that, like, you can have these, like, really empathetic experiences with characters through this weird interaction with, like, a writer, and then the illustrator translates it, and then you read it, and you are feeling these emotions from all of these different people, and it's an adaptation of a book. So it's like it goes back even further than that. And I just love that the written word in combination with illustrations can create that connection between time and space.
And it's so true in this idea of that, the empathy, right?
Yeah.
That's so important. And I want to go to Barbra for a moment to talk to us a little bit about the experience of being the I want to say caretaker, because I'm thinking graphic medicine, like medical terms, but the person who's ushering this work into the world.
Absolutely. I think, and it's so funny because, like, empathy is, like, in the back of my head, I keep thinking empathy. And I think what's so amazing is, and I promise to get to your question as well, Theresa. I think what's so incredible about graphic medicine as a whole is that, and for those who may be unfamiliar with graphic medicine, there are different components. Obviously, it's such a vast genre of comics, but there are those comics that are more designed to be informational, which are necessary and helpful in their own right. And then there are those that are designed to build empathy. And for me, as a publisher and someone who desperately wants to be mindful of what it is that we're putting out into the world, especially given that we are asking 5 different individuals with their own lived experiences with invisible disabilities or invisible illnesses to share that with the world, some of which have never done so before. I feel so, it is such a great responsibility, I think is the right word, to usher these stories and to include them in a story that is already so full of import. So I think for me it's being mindful of the fact that we are building empathy solely by, like Alex was saying, sharing stories. Like, you never know whose story you may impact. I mean, and Amber's father, you never know that it was going to elicit that response from him. And it may be a story that may be about one individual's lived experience completely separate from their own, but it triggers or it unlocks something from your own lived experience, which is incredible and which is what builds empathy in all of us. So I think that it is not only inherent in graphic medicine as a whole, that it is utilizing storytelling as a tool for building empathy. But I think that just stories in and of themselves are specifically that. They are tools for sharing so much of ourselves with one another. I hope that answers your question.
I can't wait to have this video to show the Here you go. Here's your lecture. It's fabulous. And that makes me think about this idea of the risk. The risk that we all take, being in this forum right now, but the work that we do, the work that we share. For me, I didn't even realize this, but the biggest risk in telling these kinds of stories for me was my mother. That reaction from my mom. For those who don't know, it's everybody. My mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in late 2016, and she passed away in 2017. So it was stage 4. It was very quick. But my mom was a force of nature. If you read my chapbook, you'll see there are a couple of long poems about her. What I didn't realize is that while she was alive, it was very difficult for me to share these stories because everything was you don't talk about that, you don't share. Even when she was diagnosed, my stepdad, the first thing he said was, "We are not talking about this. We're not telling anybody. We don't want people to know that we are weak." That was a huge deal. The revelation of weakness, right? And I've noticed that my dad, he's telling different stories now, just verbal stories where he used to be not secretive, but he just didn't talk about his stuff, and now his stories are like, so have you heard about this pill and that pill and there's this other injection and I had aches and pains, and so I find it really interesting how that relationship has evolved, even as I've been dealing with my mom's, illness and telling that story. So once she passed, all of the stories just started coming out, and for some reason they came out first in poetry, and now more in the visual form, and now in some developing comics. So I'm really interested in having you share a little bit about this experience of that risk, taking that risk, putting this work into the world. So whoever would like to start with that one.
Okay, I'm happy to.
Please.
For me, and Theresa, going back to your question about what is the role or the responsibility of ushering that in, for me, one of the things that I think made me the most nervous, because I want to be mindful, I certainly don't want to disrespect anyone or ask something of someone that might be too much for them to offer, or even simply asking it in a way that might be disrespectful. One of my roles as editor on this series is to pose, as I did to Dr. Rojas, a writing prompt, connecting not only what happened to the protagonist, George, in the story and in a particular issue, but then offering to Theresa, based on your lived experience, how does this aspect of this issue relate to you?
She's very good, by the way. The prompts are fabulous, and you have that freedom to work with them and without the prompts.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that even, and I was bowled over again by the responses and the essays that we received, but I think that there is this this fear of wanting to, not fully understanding someone else's lived experience, but still wanting to be empathetic, compassionate, and understanding of what they might have gone through, and trying to relay that to someone solely through, written exchanges. So hopefully, that was certainly my biggest risk. I feel like, asking someone to put themselves out there, but asking in a way that is respectful.
Yeah, you navigate it. So I don't know how anyone says no to you, to be honest. You navigate that. So I'm like, of course I'll do this. And a festival at the same time, of course. How about Alex?
For me, it was kind of funny because the risk assessment, I think, came kind of after I had started sharing more personal stories. Because initially, when I was trying to break into the industry, I was kind of trying to cater my work more towards the direct market. So it was, sci-fi, fantasy, the very genre-heavy work. And when it was suggested to start focusing more on my own experiences and slice of life work, that felt very natural and very kind of innate in a way that things like science fiction and fantasy just never sat with me in that same way. So I started doing it, and then once the work started going out into the world and people started responding to it, that's when I was sort of stopped in my tracks and started thinking, oh, people are seeing this, and these are very personal anecdotes that are going into this work. So kind of like Barbra was saying, then it became about, okay, how do I share this without offending people or saying something that's going to come off as insensitive, or even though it was my own personal stories, it was something that I wanted to be as universal as possible once I started thinking about it, because it is about building empathy. It is about connecting with an audience, and I think that's what an artist in any medium is truly after, just a moment of connection. And so I did start to think about that a little bit more, but it never really felt risky to me. It always felt like I had finally found the sort of genre, the template that I needed, and that somehow I stumbled onto later in life, which is perfectly fine. I mean, everybody has their own path. But once I found that kind of roadmap to, just like self-exploration and discovery and reflection, it made a huge difference in my work. So the risk wasn't as frightening as not putting the work out there. So that definitely made the decision for me.
I think for myself, when I'm thinking about risk, in terms of working on The Secret Garden, it's my first very, very large publisher project, and before this book, I've been going to shows like these smaller shows like this and zine fests, which are all about self-publication, and that's really where my heart is, because any story can be told, and there's very little pushback from anybody. I oftentimes tell this story. I went to a zine fest once, and I saw this very beautiful print, and I asked the woman what it was. She called it her anus prints. And she proceeded to tell me exactly how she made them. And I loved that so much because it was so unique. It was so unique, and
This panel just took a turn.
but yeah, so. But the risk is small because it's a small audience, and a lot of times when people make scenes, they're like, well, I made 100 of them, and that's it. The 100 are out. And but when you're working with a big publisher, all of a sudden you become visible to a lot of people, and so for me, that was just absolutely terrifying. This idea that my artwork was all of a sudden visible with my name attached to it in a way that I've never experienced, and I think that's really hard to say these days because of the internet, and you can have these really big connections with people online, but for some reason, knowing that you have this like physical object that you don't have to, navigate to and find the thing. And he's like, oh yeah, here it is. I can flip through it again and see it, and that it's in someone's home, and they've made a decision to put this thing into their house. And yeah, to me, it was sort of the risk of being invisible, and it still freaks me out. I'm still freaked out by it.
Yep, being a publisher is sort of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you have the opportunity to reach a wider audience, but on the other hand, anus prints are completely out of the question. So
I know
it's
someone was going to say it again.
I just want to bring it back to
This is not unlike when I teach Bitch Planet.
I'm fascinated
Say it
by
as many
it.
times as we can.
I wish I had bought one. I didn't buy one.
Well, see, I assumed that you did,
I did
right?
too.
Yeah, clearly,
I
she's got a
should-
whole collection of
I
them.
should have
Making
bought
a
it.
statement.
I think about it all the time.
And now we will too. Well, I think this leads us to my last question. Believe it or not, we're just about out of time. We have about 5 minutes left. And that is related to this idea of risk-taking and the creation of art, and how when you create a thing, when you tell your story, when you add visuals to it, when you turn it into a piece of art, and then you let it go into the world, whether it's 100 copies or whether it's published in perpetuity. And those of us who are folks who are beginning to think about putting their stories in the world and how they do that. So, what can you say to students, to beginners, or even folks who are maybe coming back to their art after being away? Some folks stopped at COVID, right? So COVID, for some people, they flourished, and for other people, just trying to survive, right? So maybe we can start with Barbra. What would you like to say to those folks?
Absolutely. So I will take a step back even from publishing, and I will just say that art in and of itself has such therapeutic and healing properties that I can't draw. I will draw a bad stick figure. Like, that is my drawing ability. Which is funny that I run a publishing company. I can't draw to save my life. But I recognize that if I sit quietly, which is hard because I have twin 1-year-olds, but if I sit quietly for 5-10 minutes and I just draw, or I paint, or I get some colored pencils and I color in a book, I feel for that 5 minutes a little bit of relief. I feel a little bit healthier, and I feel a little more capable of doing whatever I need to do next. And there are so many different kinds of art. There is poetry, there is illustration, there is writing. The limits are endless for art. So even if you don't necessarily have a story to tell, or you don't know what the story is that you want to tell, just start with 10-15 minutes of whatever art is accessible for you, and just do that, and just start there. And sometimes that is enough to help you find your path if there's a creative story that you want to tell, and whatever medium you'd like to do so.
Yeah, and sort of in that same kind of sentiment, I think we all put pressure on ourselves because we've been talking about reaching audiences and sharing these stories with people. But I also think it's incredibly important when you are creating art to do it for yourself. I think that's first and foremost who it needs to be created for. And there are the therapeutic properties. There is the connection to yourself and your emotions. And really, that's the only thing that's truly guaranteed about anything when you're creating art, And like I said, we're all out there, we have careers and we are, connecting with audiences, but truly, I think we all mainly create art for ourselves. And the only thing that's guaranteed, like I said, is that gratification out of it. So, I don't think reaching an audience or having a name in any specific industry is really the goal anybody should be reaching for, especially if you've walked away from it for a little while. The beautiful thing about art is it's always there when you want to come back to. So there's nothing wrong with taking a break. And again, I think you have to create for yourself.
Yeah, I think it sort of relates to the panel I moderated. We were talking about education, and there's a certain age where kids sort of stop drawing, because they have this like they suddenly are not reaching what they think they should be doing. Like it doesn't look like the manga that I read. It doesn't look professional. I can't possibly be good at this then. And they're sort of missing that, like, to get to that point, you have to practice a lot. And there's also this sort of I hate the idea of this, like, the artist is this magical being that has been gifted with art. And that's so not true, because we're all artists. And your art could be cooking. Your art could be, trimming your bushes outside, and you just do them beautifully. And it's just this experience of making. And it doesn't have to be like professional illustration. That's something that you can certainly pursue, but like just understanding that it's not this like magical thing. We were all artists, and you don't have to feel this like I'm not good at it, because if you want to be professional, you can be. But that's not, like we're saying, it's not the goal. The goal is to put your heart into something, and that's the outcome. And one of the things I recommend for a lot of professional artists is to also have a creative outlet outside of, say, it's illustration or writing. Like, I love to craft. Like, I love to learn all types of crafts. So, like, I even brought a crochet project with me. So, and the wonderful thing about crafting is that, like, it's usually something that you give to somebody, and you're not waiting for the reviews from, I don't know, some newspaper to tell you how good your crochet blanket was.
I just remember the Crochet Today magazine.
Some of my most wonky crochet blankets are ones that my mother made, because she didn't really know what she was doing. She knew how to make a single chain, and then she would just connect them, and here you go, here's a blanket. It's always big, but I guess it's great for my lap.
It's a style.
Yeah. But now I'm like, I love it. It's my beloved little wonky blanket that my mom gave me that the dog could bite out of. But I want to add to that before we end. Don't ask for permission. Right? Don't ask for permission. No one's going to tell you, or no one should tell you that it's okay to be a writer, that it's okay to be an artist, that it's okay to be a creator. Just do it because you want to. Right? Tell the stories that you want to tell. If I could go back in time, I would tell more stories about my family before my mom passed, and maybe just not tell them that they were in the world until later. But I wouldn't have waited as long as I did. So I would like everyone, starting with Barbra, to let us know where we can find you. How can we get a hold of you?
Sure. So we're here at the convention over in the corner by the vending machines. You can find our table of our comics and graphic novels, but otherwise we're at fanbasepress.com. We're on all of the social medias. I have some business cards and bookmarks if anyone has any questions.
Barbra was smarter than I am. I did not bring any cards, and my last name is difficult to spell, but I am at table 30, and I do have some cards there. AlexSchumacherArt.com. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at AJSchumacherArt. I make it very simple, specifically for myself, because I'll forget my handle.
And you can find me at amberpadilla.com, and my social handles are at Candy Mistakes. And I'm terrible at social media, so if you have any questions, you can also email me, because I'll most likely answer you that way.
And all three of our panelists today have their tables out. As Barbra
and
mentioned. So please.
I'm across from Barbra.
So go find them today. And you can find me at Doctero, at DOCTEEROH. And the last thing I want to say is go and create the stories that you want to see in the world. Thank you so much. Yay.